My guest, Tim McMillan, was appointed president and CEO of CAP in 2014, and he's been responsible for leading activities in education and communications, as well as being responsible for policy and regulatory advocacy on behalf of CAP's member companies. In 2007, Tim was elected as a Saskatchewan Party MLA in the riding of Lloydminster, Saskatchewan. From 2010 until his appointment as president and CEO of CAP, Tim held several strategic cabinet portfolios in the government of Saskatchewan, including as Minister of Energy. Welcome, Tim. Glad to have you with us.
Thanks, Perrin. Glad to be here.
Well, let's start on Indigenous reconciliation. CAP recently released a report entitled Indigenous Engagement and ESG. And that report is the most comprehensive review that you folks have done, documenting the growing relationship between Canada's oil and natural gas producers and our Indigenous communities. The review shows that a great deal of work has been undertaken on the relationship in the last decade. How do you feel that the industry's relationship with Indigenous communities has evolved over that time? And what do you see as the opportunities to continue developing the partnership in the future?
Great question. It is something that we value a great deal. It's something that, the communities where we operate have always been very important to us, and Indigenous communities have been very much integrated into our business for decades. I think it's something we recognized several years ago was poorly understood by Canadians in general. And the interests of the Indigenous partners that we have both in our businesses and suppliers to our businesses, and it's something that we're proud to talk about. And we think it's good for Canadians to understand how we see it and where we can enable our Indigenous partners to talk about their integration is good too. On the supply chain, it's billions of dollars of supplies that are procured by our industry, a far greater proportion than goods and services that are procured by almost any other industry, and most certainly more than the federal government gets from Indigenous companies. We have Indigenous-owned companies on the board of directors of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. And, so it really goes from production right down through supply chains, and it's going to continue to grow, and it should, because they're great partners and great business people.
Why is it, Tim, that the oil and gas sector has really been in the leadership? You point out the fact that they procure more from Indigenous-owned companies than the federal government does. Why is it oil and gas that's provided this leadership?
I think we have a few advantages. One that, where we're working is very much where there's a lot of Indigenous businesses located, and that we're one of the largest capital investors into the Canadian economy. So we are procuring goods and services in and around Indigenous businesses. So they have naturally structured their businesses to be crucial in that supply chain. I also think that we have experienced growth over the last 2 decades at a time where Indigenous businesses were growing and looking to expand their role in the Canadian economy in general. And as we've taken up a larger portion of that, the two have naturally come together. And I think maybe the third thing would be our values, that we have always worked hard to engage local communities, local business providers. And it's just been such a natural fit for Indigenous owned businesses and community owned businesses to find a role with us.
Tim, let's talk for a minute about the economy. We had all hoped that by now COVID would be in the rearview mirror and we would be focusing on recovery and how to grow the economy. Sooner or later, that will happen. What role do you see for Canada's natural gas and oil sector in terms of the economic recovery when we get launched into it?
I would say if we look back a year, we're a year into the recovery, even though we're still heavily impacted by the health crisis. Over the past year, we have seen capital investment from oil and gas increase fairly substantially. We expect that it'll continue to increase next year. Global demand for both oil and gas were dramatically decreased during the lockdowns of 2020. But as of today, we are rapidly approaching record demand for both oil and gas, and that is expected to grow by the International Energy Agency all the way out to 2040, really, for oil and gas, gas growing dramatically even after 2030, where oil starts to flatline. Canada has world-class reserves. We're a world-class producer of both oil and gas. And if we can harness our ability to produce it, invest that capital in Canada, it will have a profound effect on Canada's economic recovery through the production, through the supply chain, and through the exports. We make up about 20% of Canada's exports, just the export of oil and gas. So we're going to see more investment in 2022 than we did even in 2021. We have a lot of room to continue to grow that capital investment before we get to our highs of 2014, which was $81 billion. So I think we've got a lot of opportunity ahead of us, but we have to be careful to enable Canadian production and that we aren't limiting our capacity to meet that global demand and enabling countries that don't have our high standards. And that is a legitimate risk in the medium and longer term. But as we're looking today, I think that it certainly is looking more optimistic than it has in several years.
Let's come back to this point for just a minute. I think often Canadians, because of what we read or because of what we hear in the media, assume that somehow we've moved into the post-fossil fuels economy and society. But what you're saying is demand actually is continuing to increase in the global marketplace as opposed to going down.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that our industry is one that continues to develop technology and implement technology. Some of it, renewables, are finding their ways into our businesses as well. But the base truth is global demand for oil and gas has increased every year for the last several decades, up until the COVID health crisis. And though we are still in the health crisis, it has rebounded back to close to record levels and will increase fairly dramatically into the future. The International Energy Agency's base forecast has oil growing at about 7% over the next decade, gas at about 15%, and continuing to grow in market share out to 2040 for natural gas displacing coal. And actually, it's probably the largest reduction in greenhouse gases that we can get globally. It certainly was in Canada and the US, is displacing coal, electricity with natural gas. In the short term, it is the most viable option we have for global reductions.
And why Canadian oil and gas? If the demand is growing, should it be filled by Canada or by other countries?
Yeah, no, great question. Obviously, we are huge proponents for Canada. The way we produce is unique. If you look at the global top 10 producers for oil and gas, we truly stand alone. That there are a lot of countries like Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Venezuela, Russia, Kazakhstan. In the top 10 for oil and gas, the US would be the other one that we would consider a high quality producer. But other than us in the US, there are a lot of countries that don't share our values or our high standards. And we will continue to improve on our production techniques next year and the year after that. We need to, that's part of our value proposition. But as we're meeting a global energy demand crisis right now in certain countries, Canada is the obvious choice for increased supply.
Last question. You can't talk about oil and gas without talking about climate policy, obviously. And the global desire to reduce emissions, if it's never been greater than it is today. Yet, as you're pointing out, demand continues to grow, and recent events in European and Asian energy markets have shown the necessity of reliable, affordable energy for continued economic growth. Now, so what is Canada's natural gas and oil industry doing to reduce emissions in our own production to position ourselves as a global supplier of choice in a rapidly evolving energy market?
Yeah, the realities of the energy crisis are harsh, and we're seeing price spikes in Europe, and we're seeing blackouts in Asia. What we're also seeing is a substantial increase in coal-fired power plants, in coal production, and in coal exports globally. We need to enable more low carbon fuels to get into the market. And actually, the good news is Europe has just included natural gas in their green taxonomy, and natural gas will qualify for the environmental benefits that we know that it'll provide. Canada, as I said earlier, is unique that if we look at some examples of how we produce natural gas today, we have dramatic world-leading targets and reductions and policies on methane emissions. We have a footprint of the land that we take is so much smaller today than at any time in history or than our competitors. On the oil side, or oil sands in particular, they've decreased their greenhouse gas emissions by 20% over the last decade, and we're looking at similar reductions into the future. Some of that is using different extraction techniques, and some of that is finding efficiencies in how the trucks that are hauling the bitumen to their plants are integrated, and 1,000 other innovations that are in that pipeline that Canada is has a unique ability to bring to market. We're not going to rest on our laurels. We're going to continue to innovate and find new and better ways to produce the products that the globe is demanding.
So if climate change is an existential issue for the world, Canadian oil and gas can be part of the solution.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you look at it with the realities that we're facing, oil and gas are essential, and Canadian oil and gas are essential to getting the outcomes that we're all striving towards.
Tim, thanks for being with us. Thanks for sharing that perspective on such an important sector for Canada.
Appreciate it, Perrin.